This episode is brought to you by Snapple. Want to know another Snapple fact? The first hot air balloon passengers were a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Ridiculous. Check out Snapple.com to find ridiculously flavored Snapple near you.
Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast, where our mantra, as ever, is ho ho homosexual, the ruling class is ineffectual. I'm Bryan, an editor at Slate, and a very effectual homosexual, if I do say so myself. I have to tell you guys, it's kind of an awkward vibe in the studio today. Do y'all remember that cool lesbian who used to be on the show before she dipped on us for like a younger, hotter gay podcast? Her name was Christina Cauterucci, and she kind of showed up today expecting like an interview or something. Maybe a little toxic behavior, but you know, Christina's back in the studio. I'm so kidding. Christina, we're so happy to have you back.
What an introduction. It's so great to be back. I'm like crying right now. It's a pleasure to be the subject of one of your legendary intros.
Oh God, my very ineffectual intros.
Hopefully you're ready for me to just waltz right back in like nothing ever changed.
We absolutely are. We're desperate for it, in fact. This is sort of a little tease ahead of your full return, which will be sometime later in the summer. But today we get to talk about the other pod.
Which, by the way, as anyone who's ever left somebody for like a younger and hotter anything knows, it's no comparison. You win every time.
Aw, thank you. We appreciate that. But the other pod is, of course, the new season of Slow Burn, which is called season 9, I believe, which is called Against Briggs, which, listeners, it is out today when this episode drops, and it is truly fantastic. I really can't wait for you all to go listen to it.
Hey, Outward listeners. Warmer, sunnier days are calling. Fuel up for them with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals in time for summer thanks to the menu of chef-crafted meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. When it comes to delivery services like this, I have pretty high standards. I'm happy to say that the meals I got to try from Factor were really, really good. The ingredients tasted super fresh, the portions were solid. I think my favorite plates were the turkey chili with zucchini and the creamy tomato pork chop with cauliflower. If those sound good to you, keep in mind that there are 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, so you'll always have new flavors to explore. Head to factormeals.com/outward50 to use code outward50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code outward50 at factormeals.com/outward50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active.
In 1978, gay people in California faced a dire threat.
Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
The teaching profession is riddled with the homosexual element.
John Briggs is going to fire every gay and lesbian school teacher in the state of California.
I'm Christina Cauterucci. This season on Slow Burn, we'll explore how a nationwide backlash against gays and lesbians led to a massive showdown in California.
This was tens of thousands of pissed off gay guys and lesbians roaring down Market Street.
With so much at stake, young people became activists.
We've got to fight back. We can't let this happen in California.
And activists became leaders.
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Slow Burn, Season 9, Gays Against Briggs. Out now, wherever you listen.
Christina, before we dig into that podcast, I wanted to just check in on you. Do you need like a drink of water or some tea? Like, how are you feeling?
I'm physically okay. Mentally on the edge. It's been a wild 6 months. There was definitely a point in, I want to say February, where I was just like, working on every weekend, and it felt like the podcast was taking over my life. And someone on one of our producers was like, oh, yeah, and in a month or two, it'll really be like crunch time. I'm like, I'm sorry, is this not already the crunch time? Like, how does it get worse than this? But it's obviously such a privilege to be able to immerse myself in this incredible story. Also, to not have to pay attention as much to what's actually happening in the world right now.
Yeah, sure.
To be like working on a story where I already know how it ends.
You're living in 1978.
Yeah, it's great. It's like I've already have emotionally processed it because I know the entire story. And yeah, it's been unlike any other work experience I've ever had in terms of its all-encompassingness and also in terms of the investment I feel in the final product.
Well, I'll set up that final product a little bit for our listeners in case they are not familiar. The show is primarily focused on the Briggs Initiative, which was a California ballot measure in 1978 that would have banned gay teachers from working in public schools, among other things. Its proponents wanted to capture the success of Anita Bryant down in Florida in pushing similar anti-gay legislation. And of course, if they could quell the tide of gay liberation that had been growing since Stonewall in 1969 in California, which of course is home to the queer bastion of San Francisco, then it would be a major victory for the right and a devastating defeat for the nascent gay movement. The stakes were very high. And major figures from the queer history books were on the scene, like Harvey Milk and Cleve Jones, as well as other lesser-known but equally essential activists like Amber Hollabaugh. I don't think it's a spoiler at this point to say that we ultimately won, but victory was by no means guaranteed, and getting there was not easy. You might say that the whole situation forced our young community to grow up in a number of ways and fast. Christina has worked her ass off on the show since the fall, and the result is something spectacular, an informative, moving, funny, heartbreaking document of one of the most pivotal moments in queer history in this country. It was such a privilege to get to listen early and help with the edits, and I'm delighted Christina is here to talk a bit about the process of making Gays Against Briggs a reality.
Thank you so much, Bryan. That was such a great, concise, and effective synopsis of it. Excellent work.
Thank you. I think before we jump into the questions, we're just going to listen to a little clip from the trailer.
First, it was Dade County.
Voters in the Miami area repealed civil rights for gay people by a 2-to-1 margin.
In the late 1970s, cities around the country began rolling back anti-discrimination laws that protected gay people.
And then it was Wichita, St. Paul, Eugene.
Successful campaigns against the gay community, which shocked us all.
A state senator from California watched the laws fall and saw an opportunity.
Homosexuality is a most repulsive lifestyle.
His name was John Briggs, and he wanted to deliver the anti-gay movement its biggest prize yet.
California realized that they were coming for us.
All right, Christina, how did you settle on covering this story in particular? It's a moment that, is in the queer history books for sure, but it's not really talked about, I'd say, like in popular culture or whatever, in the same way as like Stonewall or ACT UP activism in the 80s. What drew you to the Briggs Initiative?
So I should say the idea did not generate the idea. The idea was already there. I actually don't know who was the person who came up with it, but it was sort of presented to me. But I know that it was chosen as the topic for this slow burn in part because of its resonance with our current moment in queer life and queer politics. There was a narrative that was taking hold back in the late 70s that there was a unique threat that gay people posed to children, that they were likely child abusers, and that they were, even if they weren't, groomers, molesting children, that they were going to recruit them into the gay lifestyle, and that's how gay people reproduce, since they couldn't reproduce biologically. Right. Obviously, we're seeing that same narrative take hold today, which, what a trip to talk to the people who fought it the first time around. They're all absolutely horrified by what's going on right now. But for me, the reason why I wanted to accept the assignment and work on this podcast was because it really felt like a crossroads for the gay rights movement as a political entity, where it was the first statewide vote on gay rights. And while there were a smattering of gay rights organizations around the country, which really exploded after Stonewall, there wasn't a lot of working together. The bigger national gay rights groups, some of them had just started, like the National Gay Task Force, Lambda Legal. They were babies. And there wasn't a sense that people really knew how to win a fight like this and a popular vote. It's also really interesting because sort of what was happening back then was the people who were passing some of these gay rights legislations, city councils and what have you, were actually getting a little bit ahead of public opinion. So what was happening across the country was a lot of ballot initiatives that were repealing existing civil rights for queer people. And, this guy in California, John Briggs, this state senator, thought, I'm going to do you one better and put on a ballot initiative that sort of proactively persecutes gay people and bans them from this segment of society. And to me, that the fact that this was such an important moment brought people together across class, race, gender in a way that hadn't really been done before in California and really across the country on this scale is really exciting to me. And I think because it's not something that is sort of widely talked about in the same way that, let's say, Stonewall is, I found it really exciting to learn about all these people who don't get talked about in the same way as Harvey Milk and really pick apart why this worked, why what happened, and what these people did.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, one of the things that you remind us in the show is that there actually were like municipal level, generally protection ordinances that had been passed earlier in certain cities and places that you might not expect.
Wichita, Kansas.
Wichita, yeah. Like in Wichita, right? It's sort of surprising that these places did have sort of non-discrimination ordinances of one sort or another. And that's what you were saying, the right, sort of evangelical right especially was going after. So it was this, period of some success, maybe surprising success, and then backlash. So you just mentioned, talking about the various figures and players beyond the name most people will know, Harvey Milk and maybe Cleve Jones. Can you just give us a little bit of like a map of the figures in the podcast? And I'm also interested in sort of what alliances maybe surprised you, or just when you sort of look at it from like a bird's eye view, just give us that portrait.
Yeah. So there were, in general, 3 different sort of camps of queer activists.
Right.
There were what people called the suits, which were the sort of professional gays. They had money. They were very into making sort of major political alliances with straight leaders. In fact, they often didn't like having gay people sort of out front in the political movement.
Right. Certainly not like squishy.
Oh, hell no. They were very anti-femme. I talked to one guy in the podcast who was like, oh yeah, they hated me because I was too effeminate. They thought that it would make straight people hate gay people more. And they were a lot of the big fundraisers, for instance. Then there were what they called the streets, which were the grassroots activists. A lot of the people who I spoke to for the podcast identified themselves or were members of one of these more grassroots groups. And they did a lot of outreach to unions, which this was one of the big coalitions that formed around the Briggs Initiative. It was a major landmark in terms of partnerships between organized labor and gay activist groups.
And it was the Teamsters specifically,
yeah, so it
right?
started...
Am I remembering that correctly? Like the most butch one that you can kind of imagine.
And there were a lot of people. So that started in 1974 with Harvey Milk and a couple other people in San Francisco teaming up with the regional head of the Teamsters, who lived just a few blocks down from Harvey Milk's camera store. They kind of looked at each other and saw potential in each other and said, okay, it looks like organized labor could really help gay people get what we need. And the head of the Teamsters was like, you guys are doing a lot of great stuff. I think you could help us do what we need, which they were launching a boycott against Coors, which was union busting and also homophobic and racist. So they launched this major Coors beer boycott. It was super successful. They got Coors out of every gay bar in the state, more or less. And it really did a lot to build trust among union members, and especially among, rank and file union members who were then willing to stand up for gay people when the Briggs Initiative came along. And there were 1,000 unions in the state that stepped up and signed on against the Briggs Initiative, largely in thanks to this group, one of the more left-wing groups. And then in the middle was Harvey Milk's group and a lot of the people he allied with, who were very much the sort of, aligned with the Democratic Party, traditional campaign stuff, going door to door, doing, voter registration. They registered thousands of people to vote in California that year. And, one of the things I heard from a lot of people was that women and men were working together, sometimes for the first time. This was already a little bit in the works, and every activist group, they called it co-sexual leadership. So there would be one man and one woman,
right.
You know, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You've got to have a woman in leadership. And it's almost like quaint to think of now, because obviously now we have a very different view of gender, even among mainstream queer political groups. But at the time, that was really, it was like your women won't join your group if there's not a woman in leadership. And there were a lot of lesbian separatist groups that were like, we're not even working with gay rights groups because we don't feel like they represent our needs. We're going to align with the feminists who are organizing for the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah, no, one of the great subplots of the show is can gay men and lesbians like cross the edge and work together or not, because there's a lot of pain and suspicion and you know, rightly so, particularly on the side of lesbians toward gay men who are men in the end and can be misogynistic anyway. Like that is such a fascinating story that you tell, because they had to work, you know, they needed to, but there was a historically not always the closest of friends.
It was
right?
wild to look back at this time when, you know, the LGBTQ movement wasn't really seen as such. Gay men and lesbians didn't even always see their interests as that. They're like, you know, we're getting discriminated against in very different ways. You know, for men, it was a lot of police harassment and arrests. And for women, you know, there were certainly police raids on lesbian bars and stuff, but it was a lot of, you're getting your kids taken away from you. Your ex-husband is, you know, taking you to court to take custody away from you because you're in a lesbian relationship now. And then, you know, dealing with a lot of general misogyny and all the ways in which women are oppressed for being women. Yeah. And this was a moment where a lot of gay men were realizing that we can't beat this unless we have women working with us. And lesbians were realizing this affects us too. You know, this is something that we need to find ways to work with men on. And it involved a lot of education on the part of women, you know, coming to men and saying, don't call us girls, you know, call us women. Right. If you're going to put a picture on a flyer, like try to have women and men, you know, you can't just have the movement represented by men's faces all the time. And I would say there was a lot more effort on that than there was to build a multiracial movement. There are very few people of color in leadership roles in sort of the main groups that emerged to fight the Briggs Initiative. But I did talk to this one amazing leader. She was one of the campaign managers of Harvey Milk's group, Gwen Craig, who really took it upon herself to bring the campaign to Black spaces. I mean, the variety of tactics these groups were using will amaze you. It was just, there's one episode where we kind of go through all the different things that people were doing, really making it up as they go. Even the part about going door to door canvassing, very classic campaign stuff, they modified to fit what they were doing and the stories they were telling. It just tickles me. They were really throwing everything against the wall to try to figure out what would work. And what ended up happening was, you know, these sort of three factions didn't put their differences aside and work together. They were like, you know, we're not going to tear each other down, but also we're each going to do what we think will work. And I happen to believe, and I think history reflects, that they all did play their part. You needed the people who had the connections with major moneymakers. You needed that statewide expensive advertising campaign. You needed the people going door to door and registering voters, and you needed the outreach to unions and having, you know, conversations in churches and everything that the grassroots group did, the big rallies, the speak outs, the debates that they organized. It's so exciting to see, or for the past 6 months, to have spent so much time looking at all the variety of ways that people found to use their own skills and also, without compromising on their values, fight against this one thing together.
Yeah, that is really beautiful. And it's hard not to look at what you're just describing and think of it as, you know, sort of queer excellence. Totally. It's just all of this creativity and humor and you know, artistry, like all of that stuff is in play. And it makes, you know, the movement against a ballot initiative trying to convince voters not to vote for this thing far more impressive than, you know, you might think that sounds.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I didn't get into too much in the podcast was I went to the GLBT Historical Society archives in San Francisco, which is a magical place. And the people who run it are brilliant. But I found all these flyers of fundraisers for the Briggs Initiative. You know, you had the people mostly based in LA who were doing the big ticket fundraisers. Then you had people in San Francisco who were hosting like a tag sale, fight garbage with garbage, and, you know, raising small amounts of money. But this was what they could do. Yeah. Or there was a group that was like, workers at independent film theaters against the Briggs Initiative. And they had a gay film festival. This is like, you know, just a bunch of people who worked at theaters. Like, this is what we can do. We're going to throw this gay film festival to raise what we can where we are. It was really quite inspiring. And like you said, just so creative, so much ingenuity that was reflected in every part of the campaign.
Was there a moment in your archival work where you found something that just really surprised you or caught you off guard or even like moved you? Is it with like a, you know, maybe a particular document or flyer or something?
One thing that comes to mind, you mentioned Amber Hollabaugh as one of the sort of underknown, undersung activists. She was just this amazing woman who died right before I started doing research for this podcast, she was a high femme lesbian who, at a time when there was a lot of skepticism about butch femme among lesbians, ended up being a real important spokesperson for femdykes. She grew up in a working class town in California and did a lot of driving around alone in her van to these small towns, finding maybe one person who would support the Briggs Initiative and finding a way for them to advocate in their own community. She would personally debate in front of like a gymnasium full of people, conservatives in those towns, because no one was going out there to say like, hi, I'm a lesbian, here's what we are, you know? Maybe the people in your town, there are obviously gay people there, but they're invisible. I found something that she wrote, which was, I forget how many pages, but it was a thick packet that she wrote showing people how to have hard conversations about the Briggs Initiative with people who disagreed with you, which I feel like there's rightly so a sort of a movement at this point that's skeptical of how valuable those conversations are. I think there's a great deal of people, especially in our era of misinformation and disinformation and like extreme right-wing fuckery, who cannot be convinced by rational debate. However, it was really gratifying to see somebody lay out how to respond to some of the terrible things that people were saying about gay people at that time. Because there was a sense, having looked back at all of these gay rights failures around the country, like in Miami with Anita Bryant and in Wichita and all these other cities where people were calling gays pedophiles and no one really knew how to respond to that. It's like, what do you just say? I'm not, you know? And she was, here's how you meet people where they are with what little they know about queer people and try to bring them a step or two further. And like, I just think about how painful that work must have been and difficult and frustrating and probably seemingly pointless at times. And she was not only doing it, but she was trying to help bring people along with her, people who felt like they had that kind of reserve of strength to engage in some of those conversations. It must have felt really empowering, I think, to have a little bit of a toolkit for if you're faced with some of that stuff and you don't want to just kind of check out and write it off, but if you feel like you're able to confront it.
That is taking place in the context of Harvey Milk's big exhortation to come out, right? This is like the big strategy that's being pushed by sort of that middle group that you were talking about, that like the best way to convince people to vote against this is to tell your parents that you're gay, tell your friends that you're gay, and then that will change their opinions about policy. And Amber, you were just describing, it's like she's kind of doing like that coming out work for all the people who couldn't, or like, were not in safe situations. She's like, you said like coming to town and being the lesbian to like speak to all of these people. Surely there were lesbians there, but it wasn't, they weren't able to because it wasn't safe yet. So it's an interesting role that she took on. Let's take a quick break there, and then we will be back with Christina to talk more about Slow Burn Gays Against Briggs. Okay, we are back. You got some great interviews in the show. You know, wonderful interview with Cleve Jones, who was sort of Harvey Milk's lieutenant and an amazing activist in his own right. After that, David Mixner, fantastic. The one that I'm very curious to hear you talk about sort of, you know, behind the scenes is Ron Briggs, who is the son of John Briggs, who is the politician who brought the Briggs Initiative, of course, to the ballot. Ron was like a teen basically during this time.
Yes. Yeah, I think he was 20 and working for his
dad, like very much in the rooms where this was happening. But he speaks freely with you about it. I just was curious what it was like to have a conversation with someone where the father is the enemy. And, you know, I think it seems like he kind of gets that, but then isn't, I don't know, like apologetic as you might expect. So I don't know. I'm just curious to hear what was it like to talk to Ron?
He was a great interview and so game. And, you know, I give him a lot of credit for chatting with me and spending actually hours when it all was said and done between the interview and then looking through some documents that he had from his dad. But when I first got in touch with him, I think I just called a number that I found for him through, you know, one of these public records databases. And immediately I knew it was going to be a great interview because he was like, wow. Whenever anyone wants to talk to me about my dad, it's usually for Proposition 7, which this Briggs initiative we're talking about was Proposition 6. But he had another one on the ballot at the same time about the death penalty. Ron Briggs is now a very vocal anti-death penalty advocate. And so people like to talk to him about how, you know, he switched sides, basically. He said, no one ever wants to talk to me about Prop 6, the Briggs Initiative. And, you know, I would love to talk to you about it. Also, my dad's dead now, so I can say whatever I want. And I was like, oh, yes. Okay, that's exactly what we want. And I found him to be very clear-eyed on the fact that, you know, what they were doing was wrong. And there's a sort of a pivotal moment that comes at one point in the series that I won't spoil, where he really gets the sense that, oh, God, we're on the wrong side of this. But continues with the campaign. And, you know, he is still very much a Republican, but also is, you know, Republican, an anti-Trump Republican, and is also somebody who has very reasonable, it seems, views on gay people. He doesn't still think Prop 6 was the right thing to do, which another person I interviewed for the show does still think it was right. But yeah, Ron was, you know, he said several times, like, my dad was a huge jerk, and he has a very complicated relationship with his dad where, you know, they worked together for quite some time and they lived close to each other. And apparently his dad had no boundaries and was just constantly showing up unannounced. And, you know, it felt very much like maybe he was even still unsure about his relationship to his dad. I love him, but he's a jerk, you know. The relationship probably a lot of us have with various family members. And like I said, it was not only do I give him a lot of credit for talking so freely with me about all that stuff, but also he was the source of some of the wildest anecdotes that appear in the series, stuff that actually not all of it has appeared in the histories that I've read. I actually hadn't read any other interviews with him about this. And so I had, you know, read some histories informed by interviews with John Briggs's old campaign managers and stuff who didn't speak to me, never returned our messages. But hearing from somebody who was actually a family member and who was able to give us insight into who this person was and why he did what he did, instead of just sort of the political analysis and what he said he was doing, was really valuable. And it was a lot of fun, too.
So, Christina, this is a, you know, very serious story full of huge stakes. There's loss, there's death. Like it's if you know Harvey Milk's story, you know, you can tell where that's going to go. But I also found myself laughing a lot, especially at just like the gayness of how people sort of talked about things and conceptualized things. Just so a lot of moments of like, our people are great, like kind of pride. Can you maybe just speak to that or share a moment of, you know, like humor or queer joy that really stuck with you from your reporting?
There was so much of it. I would honestly just find myself, you know, laughing alone at my desk or kind of tearing up with joy at my desk, listening to a lot of this old audio, especially where, I mean, just one of the sort of gems that I happened across pretty early in my research was this audio collection at the GLBT Historical Society archives from these two radio shows, queer radio shows from back in the day. One was called Fruit Punch. One was called The Gay Life. And they were two of actually quite a few gay radio shows that were out there at a time. I mean, I'm so jealous of this golden age of gay radio. Those shows were there were people made a song about everything. There were all of these original songs, some of which I think maybe one or two do appear in the series, but like people were so creative and so gay, and everything was camp humor and a lot of not taking themselves too seriously. Oh my God, there was one line that I came across on one of these radio shows that was so funny. It was there ends up being this big queer riot at the end. A riot that I actually don't think has been sort of depicted in anything that I've seen or listened to.
I didn't really know about it. Not in detail.
It wasn't in the Milk biopic, and it's got incredible dramatic potential, which I think we milk quite well. And I'm excited for people to hear about it because it's really inspiring to me. But afterwards, some of the people in the riot, and this didn't end up making the final cut, were prosecuted for their involvement. And on one of the shows, they were like, oh, yeah, it's sort of like the hot thing in the Castro right now is to get your subpoena for this, grand jury, whatever, investigation. And everyone who didn't get one has subpoenas envy. Like, what? Who came up with that phrase? It was just so good.
Subpoenas
I'm
envy.
like, and just thinking about people being like, oh, yeah, I was at the riot, but like I wasn't important enough to get subpoenaed. And the riot scene is another one where like it's really serious and people are getting injured and cops are attacking them, but also the people who I interviewed who were there just had the funniest memories from it. That I really hope that you guys listen to it because it's so heartwarming to me. But there were so many like person on the street interviews at protests and Gay Freedom Day, which was the San Francisco precursor to Pride, where I'm like, this could have happened, on my block in 2024. There's one interview that didn't make it in, and I fought for it, but like there wasn't room because it just has nothing to do with the story. But this host is interviewing someone on the street, and he's like, okay, so just to give our listeners a picture, you have a teal wig, and the person's like, aquamarine. And then they're like, okay, and
get it right.
You've got red glitter in your eyebrows and mustache. And it looks like your fake eyelashes are about 1.5 inches long at least. It's just like,
my God,
this person is just oozing personality. And then I think they go on to say, I, don't care about middle class values and like I'm here to just like be myself and screw anyone who thinks otherwise or something like that. But, and then there are people sprinkled all throughout the archival audio who feel like they're speaking directly to me in 2024. And I wrote a little bit about this in the essay that will be published on our launch day, the Slate website. But it really changed my relationship to queer history to feel like there's so much about our lives and so much of a sort of, I want to say birthright. That feels kind of fascistic, but like there's stuff that we've inherited. Heritage that has so strongly stood the test of time that makes it possible for me to recognize queer culture back then. And, the way that lesbians talked about feminism and talked about the way they were transforming their, structures of power and running things as collectives. It feels like we truly are the beneficiaries of stuff that they've built, forms of art and humor that they've innovated, certainly the political strategies that they developed in this fight against the Briggs Initiative. And it just made me feel so warm and tingly to be immersed in their world and feel like there were some really beautiful ways that it wasn't so different from mine.
Yeah. I felt similarly. Yeah, listening to it. You brought up riots and protests. I'm sure that when you set out to make the show, the sort of resonances with our current anti-queer political climate were part of why you said you did it. It's easy to listen to this and think about legislation that we've been covering on the show for years now, and just, you know, how that's all come back around again. But it struck me that one thing you probably couldn't have prepared for was the fact that this is coming out in the midst of a big protest movement in the United States, right? On college campuses around Gaza, and not just on college campuses either, and in cities around the country. How do you think this project speaks to that, or what's going through your mind when you sort of switch from listening to tape from your show to looking at the news? Because, you know, we're seeing these questions of what is a riot, what kind of protest is legitimate, like, do things have to get broken or not, or like, you know, and that's all being dealt with by the figures in your story. Exactly these questions, especially toward the end.
Yeah, there's a speech that this amazing woman, Sally Gearhart, gave after the riot. She's somebody who was Harvey Milk's sort of radical lesbian feminist counterpart in the fight, and somebody who, again, died actually not too soon before we made this podcast, but somebody who has really gotten the short shrift in terms of historical depictions of this fight. They didn't show her at all in the Milk biopic, which a lot of people I talked to were very upset about, because she really was, you know, right there beside Harvey Milk, and somebody who was very important to bringing women on board, to making them trust in this movement. Anyway, she's an incredible speaker. She was actually a rhetoric professor at San Francisco State, one of the first out lesbians to get tenure at a major university. And she was somebody who, on the night of the riot, had said Harvey hated violence and, you know, we shouldn't be doing this, whatever. But afterwards gave a speech where she's sort of addressing Harvey Milk posthumously and saying, you know, we all know you hated violence, but also we know that you knew that until a movement moves in the streets, we don't have a chance that anyone will hear us. I'm paraphrasing. That might not have been exactly how she said it, but there's a great history of nonviolent protest, successful nonviolent protest in this country. And there's also a lot of cases in which riots and violence against property, which is what a lot of this is, you know, it's people saying that like breaking windows and setting cop cars on fires is violence. That has brought about political change. And more than that, galvanized a movement because it's an expression of righteous rage. And it's an expression from people who are done with being stepped on or whose voices aren't being heard in other ways. And I think there are a lot of legitimate forms of protest. It was really interesting to learn about the response to this one, which, because it comes at the end of the podcast, we really don't get into that much. But there were not only straight people who were condemning the riots, but gay people, too, who were saying, you know, this is going to reflect poorly on us. It actually, Cleve Jones says that it had a negative effect on San Francisco politics because they felt like, you know, people couldn't be trusted anymore. And it contributed into like a shift in the election systems, he believes. But, you know, I think when we look back at ways that not just queer people, but a lot of marginalized groups have fought for their own safety, and in this case, other people's safety, I don't think there's a wrong form of protest. And hearing about the ways the cops were treating people back then in San Francisco, not just during the riot, but in everything leading up to it. I think watching the way that the police forces have been used against these current protesters, I think is going to further radicalize people against the police forces that have been used to terrorize marginalized communities and especially Black communities for so long.
I will say that I was listening to drafts of the show the same week as the main part of the Columbia situation. And yeah, you cannot help, if you're not already sort of radicalized in that way, it is just impossible to listen to this and not see the same thing happening again and worse, because now they're militarized in a way that they weren't back then. But yeah, it's the same kind of complete misuse of state force.
Yeah. The other thing that I just want to say before we move on from this is it was really clear to me in piecing together from different accounts how this riot started that the cops escalated things and exacerbated things. And if they hadn't got involved in the way that they did, like maybe no one would have been injured, or many, many fewer people would have been injured. And what would have happened would have probably been a bunch of property damage. And instead it was property damage and 140 people injured. And, you know, however many more people sort of traumatized by what they witnessed. And so it's like, I'm sure if you reconstructed a lot of other similar situations, you would find exactly the same thing. It's that use of force that makes people angry enough to fight back.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to stop, Christina. As I said, the show is incredible. It's called Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. It launches today, May 22nd. You can, now that you're done with this episode of Outward, you should go right over and start the first episode of that. It is time well spent. I think it'll really be meaningful to a lot of people. So thank you for making it, Christina.
Thank you so much, Bryan. This was really a joy. And also the first interview I've done about it. So it was so fun to actually get to just like spout off about all of this stuff that didn't make it in and what I've been thinking about these past months.
Awesome. All right. Well, go promote it some more so that you can hurry up, get back to us. We want you.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.
All right, that's the show for this week. Please send feedback and topic ideas to outwardpodcast@slate.com, or you can hit us up on Facebook or X @SlateOutward. As always, a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you will get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on the shows like Working, and you will never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more about that, go to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show was produced by Palace Shaw, the most effectual producer in the game. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, give us those 5-star reviews so that other people can find it and join in. Until next time, bye everybody, and stay gay.